happy to introduce you Jeffrey Jerome Cohen. He's a professor of English and director of medieval and early modern studies at George Washington University in USA. And he's also wrote one of his books, Stone and Ecology of Inhuman, that you can find in our library for free. So just please give it back when you read it all, or partly. And today, Jeffrey will share with us his lecture about the No Ark. So please, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Please let me know if you can't hear me, and I just want to start by thanking Karen, Maria, and Daria for making this happen. I'm very pleased to be here tonight. So I'm going to show you a little bit of a project that I'm doing with a friend on Noah's Ark as a transport device that goes through the ages. And there'll be, I realize I'm speaking in English. I apologize for not knowing Russian. I promise you there are very pretty pictures if you have a hard time following me. So welcome to Noah's Ark. Today I want to share with you some work from a project I've undertaken with Julian Yates of the University of Delaware. We're writing a book together called Noah's Archive, groundless reading from the beginning until the end of time. And our research examines how ancient myths of a worldwide flood enduringly structure the imagination of catastrophic climate change. Narratives that flourished in ancient Mesopotamia, like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Book of Genesis, live on in dystopian tales of sea level rise, from novels to art to film. Against rising oceans and superstorms, we, like Noah, build preservational arks of various sorts and leave the rest of the world to drown. Really, the problem that we're trying to solve with this project is why is it that humans keep retelling the same story over and over again, from the very literal beginning of human history to contemporary science fiction, and always involves arcs and only a few people given shelter as they move into the future. So, the charismatic transport device known as Noah's Ark continues to ply the seas of ecological thinking. In the course of writing this book, my collaborator and I are visiting a series of replica arks that have been built around the world. You can see us right at the bottom there. We're visiting an ark in Frostburg, Maryland in the United States, one that will probably never be finished. Each modern iteration of the biblical vessel speaks a personal as well as a communal story of being so caught up in the archive for making the structure magnificently real here and now. Our challenge to ourselves is to love these arks as much as their builders do, even as the beliefs that motivate their construction are not our own. We know that if any of these arks, especially the ones we're visiting, should ever set sail, we would be left to the outside. So, an ark, to give a provisional definition, an ark is a strong box in which are conserved against cataclysm an inadequate number of new beginnings. An ark is built through violence, and its hospitality is extended at cost. An ark's delineating and defensive walls will inevitably prove porous, its contents unsettled and full of stowaways, its trajectory will be adventure-filled, and its future laden with unforeseen possibilities. Every ark is an invitation, the inevitable welcoming of a world far larger than its manifest would allow. Materializing spaces of circumscription and confinement, sorting the various and the volatile into fixity, an ark can take the form of a museum, a seed vault, a biosphere, a starcraft, a zoo, a library, a ship, a database, a book repository, or even in some ways with this exhibit that we're in right now, a hotel. To engineer such a structure is to perform a gesture of despair and desire at once. Despondency at a world not to be saved, but confidence after disaster in a better home to come. Yet an ark is not launched in the expectation of a more survivable or commodious world for everyone. Selective and small, its spaces tend to be closed against a cosmic diversity of humans and non-humans, conserving meager community against a general ruin. Its welcome is never wide enough. Every ark preserves at a price, and arks easily become prisons. The prospects they're built around will prove lethal to many, both inside and out. Yet the same ark that reduces boisterous lives to sortable, storable units and attempts to regulate the plots and stories it conveys will inevitably open to the imagination into hazard and surprise. An ark conserves against present disaster and promises the resources necessary for beginning over again. An ark also attempts to assert human agency within, upon, and against a world of non-compliant, non-human actors that will refuse containment. Creatures, elements, storms, oceans, climate, toxins, atoms, time, and every force and object placed at the outside of the ark press back, environ, and cry out. An ark attempts to populate the world otherwise, and thereby extends a provocation to think the world's contingency and capaciousness, a chance to escape confinement and tell better stories, to begin again, but without necessarily obliterating what comes before. As the patriarch Noah came to know when he constructed his box of animal preservation with a single opening to a precise number of cubits, the vessel's form can be constricting, and its interior is often claustrophobic. Yet the creatures housed inside are not frozen in time. They live, they breathe, they eat, they shit, they struggle. As Noah organized his ark's creatures and narratives, its walls proved far from watertight. Possibility and dissension seeped inside. Passengers not on the manifest were discovered. Aboard this millennium-crossing transport device constantly erupted vexing perplexities and unexpected dramas. As Noah's menagerie of origins and carefully loaded horde of prospects sailed toward unforeseen destinations, the ark assumed many forms that have kept it available even now for boarding, remodeling, and relaunching. Most tales we tell about the survival in the face of cataclysm center upon dauntless men like Noah and the walled architectures they built against a world of flame and flood. When non-humans are invited into the narrative, they exist for human sustenance and support. Yet, if we construct an enclave against rising oceans, or erect barriers and fortifications to keep out waves of zombies or climate refugees, if we wall up a country against floods of immigrants, to what consequences do we doom all of those banished to the exterior? Might it not be worse to be inside the wall, captive to constricted community? What happens when the bubble pops and the walls are breached, or the ark arrives on a mountaintop or a distant planet? What are the world left behind? Do the drowned have an enduring story? Do the rocks, the waves, and the turbulent air? What's lost when the flood arrives, as well as when it recedes? What perishes through renewal? Do things ever get better? I want to just call your attention to this beautiful illustration. It's the kind of thing that could only have been made at one time in human history. It's from a Hebrew manuscript from Cologne at a time before Cologne as a city had learned not to like its Jewish population. So a Jewish scribe did the layout, and Christian illustrators did the picture. And it's the kind of communal effort that could only have existed at one time in history, and we're lucky to still have a trace of it. The other thing that I'd point out is that all art pictures are always fascinated by what goes on below the ark. You can barely see fish there. And love to follow the trajectories of the dove, which is always obedient, it obeys the law, and the raven, which never pays attention to anyone and goes its own way. So if you keep looking for doves and ravens in these pictures, you'll see the stories that they tell. In the book of Genesis, let me show you some other Noahs. In the book of Genesis, Noah is the second patriarch and the second origin. He's typically understood as representing proper human obedience to the divine law. Very often he stands in for all human beings, but specifically, he has a tendency just to stand in for strong white men. The flood story in its retellings across the centuries, though, has proved hospitable to reinventions. Its plots defeat linear history and they loop forwards and back, activating the most dormant possibilities and launching some unexpected futures. Noah's Ark is a narrative transport device that reveals the capacity of things to have turned out differently, offering tales of transitions and incomplete totalities, of stowaways and resistance to destiny. Noah's ready assent to God's command to build an ark has spurred some difficult thinking from various points of view, lingering especially within the perspective of those outside the boat, thwarting any easy culmination in covenant and rainbow. Noah's Ark is both a sacred chest that sorts and preserves its contents so a new world can begin, as well as a Pandora's box filled with all kinds of unexpected things, a volatile mix of chaos and hope. A renewed sense of the ark within the ocean might lead us to imagine a more capacious discourse of refuge, a radical hospitality that extends far beyond human belonging. Every ark invites serious play. I'm going to show you an ark that most people learn the story of Noah from, a toy ark. With its bright red planks and green ramp for loading animal couples, the Playmobil My Take Along 123 Noah's Ark is designed for young children. Yet its website reviews make it clear that everyone loves this vibrant toy, from children too old for the plastic vessel to grandparents who give the gift to their families and find themselves absorbed into the dramas it invites. There's nothing especially authentic about this ark. The proportions are all wrong. Noah's sons and daughters-in-law are missing. The vessel resembles a tugboat, not the single-windowed box that the Bible talks about. None of the beasts are clean. No ravens are given to accompany the doves. And yet the toy works. Through an urgent invitation to play, this ark elicits curiosity, it intensifies creativity, and it yields pleasure. Even if children are meant to stow the animals aboard against a flood of soapy bathwater, the script they follow is not supposed to create anxiety. It's not supposed to make kids worry about the ending of their own world. The smiling human guardians it comes with resemble a German farming couple more than anything biblical or stern. There's no trauma, no destruction. The ark is something portable. You take it with you. Nothing extra is included to leave outside and drown. The little plastic boat remains a refuge. It's a portable and secure world for every kid to carry. And yet what child can resist pulling the vessel to the bottom of the bathtub and seeing who floats out, who will drown in the deep? How often is it that you get to play God, get to become the weather, even as these phrases now seem ironic by the emerging realities of climate change? A very long history informs this toy, mixing tales of catastrophe with a call to experiment. It's not clear how much of the Genesis narrative of Noah's Ark any child would absorb from playing with the toy. Certainly not biblical details like the wholesale submergence of the sinful world, or the meaning of the rainbow, or that business about giants wandering the land in those days. Yet this ark enacts and invites what the Genesis story itself enacts and invites, an engagement with serious play, edged by climate change and horrific loss, but opening spaces for resourceful supplement, wild invention, fugitive creation stories that unfold along with the destruction. Every ark encloses violence and danger, the best and the worst intentions, an incitement to a world configured otherwise. The book of Genesis starts with, "In the beginning," but the earth created and populated in the course of those first 6 days experiences a hard reset not all that long thereafter. Right? After Adam and expulsion from the Garden of Eden, everything has to start again and originate with Noah and his family. Noah and his family were, it seems, the first climate refugees. With global catastrophe about to destroy their home, they build a shelter against the weather to preserve family and animals so the ravaged world can be repopulated. Geology long ago taught us to disbelieve the possibility of a flood so universal that all the earth would drown. And yet, how can this narrative, ancient narrative, not seem contemporary? We live at a time when storms and rising waters are daily events. We build structures called seed banks and amphibian arcs. The climate is changing, growing warmer and fiercer. Ice caps are melting. The deluge against which we are bracing, as well as the foolish disbelief in some quarters about the reality of the coming flood, are not new stories. We've heard it all before, and that might be the problem. Myth works both cognitively and effectively. Right? Myth holds our mind and it holds our emotions. Once it's in your soul, it's hard to get it out. In these days of sea level rise, as we envision catastrophe storyline, we have a tendency to retell the Noah story in some small form, but without intricacy and without the shifts in points of view that writers and manuscript illustrators have long celebrated. Climate change demands better narratives than the easy ones we've been telling. We exclude mightily whenever we build an ark, a gated community, a wall along a national border, any architecture erected to hold a few people safe against waves of water or waves of refugees, against violence slow or swift. Those barred from such arcs or enclaves are mostly humans we refuse to call fellow, but missing from most contemporary accounts of climate change and unfolding catastrophe is the complex consideration in Genesis of the preservability and potential companionship of non-humans. The failures of our care are vast. We congratulate ourselves for dwelling in a secular age when we know the difference between science and myth. But whenever we envision ecological catastrophe, we quietly return to the biblical frames that we assumed we had surpassed. The world's ending through the melting of polar ice, the rising of the seas, and the deluge, a disaster God promised never to send again, is about to crash anew. We know in advance the contours of the story's unfolding, and we surrender to its narrative surge. Yet in that resignation, in that helpless biblical replay in a scientific mode, we lose sight of the actual complexity of the Noah story in Genesis, as well as in its vigorous afterlife. We typically take from the book of Genesis the narrative's barest elements. Noah builds an ark, animals are led inside 2 by 2, God sends a flood that scours the earth, Noah sends a raven and a dove to see if he and his oceanic menagerie may disembark. Then in the skies we see a vibrant rainbow and a sign of covenant. We also quietly repeat Noah's resignation to allowing the land and its people to sink below the rush of waters, an acceptance that threatens sometimes to become an enjoyment. We submit too easily to imagining a world in which global warming is a disembodied affair, to be viewed from the sky. As Robert Graves and Didier Madoc-Jones do, many of the images from their climate change awareness project, Postcards from the Future. This is just one of the many postcards they've created to try to warn people of what London is going to look like in 50 to 100 years if climate change progresses at the rate it's progressing at. To create the sinking metropolis of London, the artist digitally manipulated a 3D model of the city to portray the aftermath of the failure of the Thames Barrier. London as Venice shows the Houses of Parliament and Westminster Abbey radiant in the sunset, encircled by blue shimmering water. The London Eye spins peacefully above the flood. The city seems serene and unpopulated, architecture against the elements. The image gives the effect of looking down upon this watery expanse from a great distance, maybe from an airplane or a helicopter, the kind of view of the flood that Noah's dove would have had, gliding over a drowned world. Scale shift is essential to knowledge. Distant perspective can yield a capacious view impossible from the ground, assisting us in coming to understand how climate change is a planetary phenomenon imperfectly understood when point of view remains local. We need vast prospects and distant readings to comprehend the enormity of problems like climate change. Yet this bird's eye view can also prevent us from forging, in Stacy Alaimo's words, more complex epistemological, ontological, ethical, and political perspectives in which the human can no longer retreat into a separation and denial. In the midst of things, it's muddy, messy, and uncomfortable. You get soaked. You might get stuck. You may even drown. But thinking ecologically means embracing ethical saturation, refusing some dry heaven from which to view in safety what unfolds during the cataclysm. When we imagine that we can behold the planet from a great distance as a blue marble or spaceship Earth, we glimpse a dry and partial story. We also pretend that we're divine. Thomas Burnet created for his Sacred Theory of the Earth in 1690 an illustration of Noah's Ark afloat upon a wholly inundated globe. The tiny vessel is guarded by two small angels, and they're barely visible upon a wave-covered earth. You can kind of see them there, but I'll magnify it. Perspective can recede so far from anything palpable, from anything sensible, that submerged expanses cease to trouble. It's kind of tranquil looking down, imagining ourselves the Spirit of God moving over the primal waters. It's kind of beautiful, imagining yourself from such a distant perspective as a hovering presence. The following text appears on the Postcards from the Future website, describing the creation of the London as Venice picture that I just showed you. Like a modern-day Canaletto, this disturbing yet strangely peaceful aerial view of a flooded Thames was inspired by shots of New Orleans submerged after the floodwaters of Hurricane Katrina. Curious to know how London would appear under similar conditions, Graves and Madoc-Jones, the two artists behind this project, transposed projection of a 7.2-meter flooded river onto their digital 3D model of London and aligned it with a photograph of the Thames shot by Jason Hawkes, and 7.2 meters is the depth at which the Thames barrier would fall. The low light of the photograph creates an evocative sense of dimension to the view, forming the impression that we're looking at a partially submerged stage set. You can kind of see it underneath still. Graves and Madoc-Jones sink London to render the city disturbing yet strangely beautiful, evocative like a partially submerged stage set or a painting, a Canaletto. He's a painter known for combining the real and the imaginary in radiant water scenes. Their inspiration, New Orleans in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. More than a decade after the hurricane, pictures of a flooded New Orleans have not lost their ability to haunt. They require no digital alteration to make them evocative, and they should never suggest a stage set or a painting. Beneath the overspreading waters of the Mississippi are people who lost their lives when the levees broke, people who were left to drown. In the wake of catastrophe, suffering is unequally distributed. Tourists boarded buses to view in air-conditioned comfort the devastation after that storm. Katrina revealed the swift violence of ecological catastrophe and the slow violence of persistent racialized inequality in the United States. Katrina's aftermath might spur us to ask what watery London would look like if beheld not through what Donna Haraway famously called the God trick. Right? The God trick is to imagine that you're a perfect and celestial and disembodied point of view, not through the windows of a tall bus or some other ark that floats over suffering, but from the midst of the sea swell, through the eyes of those in peril on the waters, from those left to perish in the flood. Most of us know the story of Noah and the flood, not from Genesis, where the narrative is complicated, the result of multiple authors, but from a children's Bible or a toy like the Playmobil set that I just showed you, a puppet show, or maybe a cartoon. A righteous Noah built a magnificent boat during a sinful age. Animals enter 2 by 2, lions mingling with zebras and peacocks. Rain falls while Noah's family is snug against the storm. The story ends with a wayward raven, an obedient dove to bear an olive branch, landfall, and a rainbow. Absent from this sentimental version is the strange reference in the book of Genesis to the giants who dwelled upon the earth in those days, the mysterious creatures called the Nephilim, and the oblique suggestion of a sexual crime behind their arrival. Genesis 6 contains a divine command that 2 of every beast should enter the ark, while the following chapter states that only unclean beasts are taken in pairs. The clean come, 7 and 7, the male and the female. The waters prevail for 150 days and then only gradually recede, ensuring that Noah and his family are ark-bound for more than a year. When the family emerges after their long sojourn, they sacrifice some of the animals and they eat some of the others. Vegetarians before the flood, Noah and his kin after the flood become the first carnivores, devouring some of their former companions and messmates. Animals and humans are henceforth said to struggle against each other. The rainbow in the sky as sign against future cataclysm is an actual bow. It's the Latin word arcus, related to archery. It's a weapon that shoots a lethal arrow, a suspended promise within a threat. Shortly after he reclaims the world, Noah becomes so drunk on the wine he makes in his newly planted vineyard that he passes out naked. When his son Ham laughs at his father's nudity, Noah curses that son to eternal slavery. Ham becomes the father of Africa, and his banishment to servitude was eventually used to justify the American slave trade. Commanded to build an ark, Noah constructed the vessel to precise specifications. Christian tradition, for the most part, praises his perfect obedience to that command. Islamic and Jewish interpreters were a little more ambivalent. Rashi, for example, held that in relation to his generation, Noah was righteous, but had he been in Abraham's generation, he would not have been regarded as anything. Another text suggests that maybe Noah is culpable for the flood because he didn't appeal for mercy on the world's behalf. When God declares the impending destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in a flood of fire, Abraham asks God, "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" God relents, granting Abraham the opportunity to seek out those who don't deserve to perish. Recalling the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses on Sinai refuses to allow an angry God to destroy the wayward Israelites and start again. Those who argue with God in the Hebrew Bible are often rewarded for their efforts. Yet Noah is told to build an ark against the flood and simply complies, leaving the earth to drown. I think the main difference between earlier readers of the story and us is that whenever we retell the flood story, we assume that Noah is right to obey God. But for many people across time, Noah's quick assent to God rather than arguing with him as other biblical characters did is really puzzling. Why did he leave the world to drown? An ark is not a ship but a chest, and it derives from the same Greek word that gives us archive. Not all of the stories collected in Noah's archive come together. There's mentions of sons of God and daughters of men, giants, drunkenness, nudity, a threat within a promise, a movement from cross-species companionship to animal sacrifice and consumption. Nor is Noah's vessel necessarily the gated community it becomes once the Hebrew word is translated into Latin. We get the modern English word ark and many of its derivatives in other language from the Latin word arca, which just means a strongbox. But the original Hebrew word that translates is teba, and that just means a box or a boat or a basket. The word's only used one other time in the Torah to describe the floating reeds upon which Moses as a baby is conveyed from death. Noah's archive is a whirlpool of varied narratives filled with dissonance and counter stories from the start, a word or a chest. or a basket preserving all kinds of forgotten tales and alternative plots. If we realized better the complexity of the Noah narrative and its long history of augmentation and reinvention, we might not be so resigned to climate change, to allowing the world to drown. An ark is not a container, but an invitation and a welcome. And archiving is story forging and future making. Medieval depictions of Noah's Ark exult in the intricacies of the Genesis narrative. In Hebrew and Christian manuscripts, as well as sculpture, the ark could be represented as a castle, a church, a longboat, a house, a rectangular box, or even a floating orb. Animals and people often share the same tranquil expressions, and fish often swim in the oceanic peace below the vessel. Survival is for the determined, and those on board are in it together, a community of men, women, horses, owls, deer, and the occasional unicorn. The vessel itself is often a lively place with a prow that looks like an animal. Noah's Ark was typically read by Christians as an allegory, prefiguring Christ's resurrection and founding of a new order, the flood as baptism. But the ark wasn't necessarily a place of peaceful coexistence. In some Jewish traditions, for example, the raven rebukes Noah for being classified as an unclean animal, and thereby one of two rather than one of seven aboard the ark. When the raven is sent to search for signs that the flood is receding, the raven accuses Noah of potentially triggering the extinction of all ravens, since if it doesn't return, no nestlings will ever be engendered. Here's a 13th century English version of an ark that resembles almost a Gothic cathedral on the ocean. But even as allegory burgeons, the natural world continues to exert its material presence here. The illustration stresses the intimacy of humans and animals, their shared peacefulness as arkmates. The green waters around the church ark are nearly opaque, but fish swim beneath the boat. You can just see the outlines of the fish there. A dynamic world rather than a sea of death. And if I had more time, I'd talk a little bit more about how flood stories were always an invitation to imagine how happy the world must have been for things like whales and squid and other things that finally got to explore human cities and were liberated. For them, it wasn't a catastrophe at all, but it was a return to a much more open world. But stories remain alive by mutating into new forms, drawing to themselves all kinds of subplots and strange characters and taking unexpected detours. Here's an illustration of Noah's Ark from a 14th century Psalter. And if you look, you see the ark is floating on transparent waters. Intent on his business with the dove, Noah doesn't look upon the stories in the sea. You see in the upper left-hand corner, a raven is enjoying the flesh of a dead horse. For this bird, the destruction of the world has generated an unprecedented feast. And if you look underneath the ark, you'll see the devil, meanwhile, is making a secret escape from the bottom. Satan, that devil, is pulling the tail of a snake behind him to close the hole that he bored into the ark through the ship's planks. And what this story is trying to solve is the question of how was it that if God sent a flood to cleanse the world because it was so filled with evil, that the world was just as evil afterwards. And so he wanted to try to figure out how the devil got on board and then snuck out at the last minute. Meanwhile, in the floodwaters, humans and animals swim, founder, and die. Noah thinks that through obedience to God, he's cleaned the world, but the devil's underwater flight and the raven's recalcitrance suggest how other stories survive. A possibility this illustration also raises is that Noah might have come to a fuller and more sober knowledge of the world, were he only to look down, were he to behold the devil he himself has sheltered, were he to witness the men, women, and animals excluded from the ark and now perishing in the sea. The raven's knowledge. The catastrophe has not been nearly as total as advertised, and for some non-humans, disaster is opportunity, even a blessing. The Holcomb Bible is a richly illustrated manual that teaches priests how to teach Bible stories to their parishes. Its illustration of the flood shows Noah in his ark, releasing a black raven and a white dove. Below him swirl aquamarine waves that are beautifully transparent. The corpses of a man, a woman, and an ox are suspended in the waters, while a dead horse rests on a rock, food for the freedom-loving raven, content never to return to constricted life aboard the ship. The human and animal bodies drifting through the ocean are in positions that would never be possible on land, a weightless underwater dance. When through the sea drift centrally entwined corpses that still move, elegant in their watery suspension, while Noah looks resolutely forward, enraptured in his business with the birds, a dove he can control, a raven that will always veer away. Well, what exactly does this image teach priests to teach their parishioners? In the wake of catastrophe, suffering is unequally distributed. Noah is serene as he tends to the birds and assesses the livability of the flooded world for those he's preserved. But we are forced to look below the waters, to linger with the submerged, and maybe even to think of the rocks and their own tectonic temporality, their slow indifference to swift things like floods. Think now of the words of Abraham to God on the promised destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Is everyone at the bottom of the sea in the Holcomb portrait wicked? The ox? The horse? Are we allowed to linger over such questions? We could bear in mind that in both Jewish tradition and the Chester play of Noah's flood, that I'll talk about in a second, Noah takes 120 years to complete the ark, hoping that if he stretches the labor over so long a period, some of the doomed might repent. The Chester play's Noah reveals a sympathy not often seen in the figure, a man usually content to dream of doves and olive branches while the vault of heaven and the abyss pour forth their waters. In the 15th century, in this manuscript from Rouen, an intricately rendered ark offers room enough for Noah's peaceful family, some green devils over to the side, and even a unicorn over on the left. The vessel floats placidly at the front bottom of the picture, while the oceanic background is vast and vibrantly blue. Behind the ark, a water wheel spins uselessly. Swimmers seek security in home, church, and castle, structures built against the elements that are now overwhelming them, architectures that were meant to preserve. The water is full of detritus. One floating corpse is fresh, another is gone gray. One uprooted tree possesses leaves, another is a kind of arboreal cadaver. An ox swims, a dog drowns. Crows, ducks, and swans swim as they always have. Blunt rocks indifferently protrude. The deep blues of the scene are stunning. It's hard to say if we're supposed to feel the peace within the ark, the frustration of the swimmers who seek a place of rest as the world sinks, the inevitability of bodies and trees becoming flotsam. Only a bird like a raven can find much satisfaction in such a world, no matter how beautifully it's rendered. Something changes, perhaps, when we notice that just above Noah's vessel and to the left is a cradle that floats like a miniature ark, empty of its occupant. Is it possible to see that empty cradle and not fill it with a story of overwhelming loss? My punishment is greater than I can bear. These are the words of Cain, the first in a long line of complainers against God's justice. Cain's declaration might also translate as, my sin is greater than I can bear, and maybe he means both, that living with the fact of having killed his brother and being exiled to spaces far removed from community are unendurable. Either way, he protests his state to God and receives in return a mark that will preserve him from harm. Cain is the first builder of cities, of those homes and churches and castles that in this illustration are being overwhelmed by the waters on which Noah, his family, and the animals float in peace. Drown. That would seem to be the command hurled against those not wanted on the ark, an imperative that Noah does not protest when directed at those who are not his family, an injunction we repeat ritualistically whenever we envision climate change. A lively world is stilled into death, corpses beneath a churning sea, while an ark of the saved floats in safety. In a harrowing 13th century illustration of the deluge by the English artist William de Brailles, no ark appears, and thereby little hope. Scalding waters pour down from the heavens. Layers of corpses accumulate like sediments. The land animals, the beasts of the air, men and women. The exterminated demand examination. Piles of faces, human and animal, layered but not separate. The illustration makes visible what happens when we, without protest or resistance, surrender the world to be drowned. William de Brailles paints the flood without an ark. He refuses to hide what unfolds beneath the overwhelming sea. No fish swim in peace. No raven feeds upon the dead. Instead, we behold cadaverous strata, an entanglement within annihilation. Nothing breaks the sea surface. Even the ark is nowhere to be seen. There is no escape to a transcendent point of view, just immersion in waters that do not cease to flood. William provides no peace, no refuge, no floating vessel. He paints what's missing from that picture of submerged London as seen from the sky. In the wake of catastrophe, suffering is unequally distributed. This suffering binds humans to hares, falcons, pigs, dogs, ravens. In William's painting, the figures on top reach for those down below, their bodies aligned in a downward vector, a post-mortem embrace that's strangely touching and difficult to receive as mere allegory. It's impossible not to feel. Something in this picture traverses the ages. Truth can be a little colder when viewed from above, or, and this is something the Genesis narrative never offers, from inside the ark. Accepting the literal factuality of the Bible, John Wilkins in 1668 attempted to map out exactly how the ark could have preserved so many animals, and he did it by assigning each animal a certain pen and a certain amount of space, and he tried to formulate what the difference would be between giving an animal the bare amount of space it needed to live, he called it immiserating accommodation, where it couldn't move at all, versus commodious accommodation. And this is John Wilkins' plan at the top. And what he couldn't have known at the time when he sketched this out is that it became the plan for slave ships as part of the Atlantic slave trade not long after he published the book, because he'd figured out the minimal amount of space that even a human being would need in order to be transported somewhere else. There's a horrifying history that's behind being imprisoned in the ark. Another landlocked future for such an ark is the factory farm. We like to think that people in the Middle Ages or before the Enlightenment or a few decades ago were nothing like us. As an inheritance of the flood story, we want strong moments of demarcation, secure punctuation of change. Entanglement is difficult and intimacy is vexing. Despite an abiding love in literary and cultural history for sharp periods, a sympathetic relationship of viewer to the drowned has always been possible. This illustration I'm showing you now is from the Vienna Genesis from the 6th century. It's actually the first illustrated Bible ever made. You can see its picture of Noah's Ark, where Noah's Ark is that pyramid in the center, is shown from the outside. That is, it's shown from the perspective of those who haven't been admitted to it, the people clinging to the rocks and drowning. We cannot be sure if we're supposed to feel a sympathetic inclination toward those people who fight against the rising waters, or to take pleasure in divine justice, but maybe both. What matters about such immersive illustrations is that a potential for compassion, which literally means suffering with, exists, even if it's a kind of affective misreading. Sympathy's arc offers a connection that overleaps resignation to loss and affirms other futures to forge. A bulwark against fatalism, sympathy renders grim and reflexive bracing for catastrophe difficult to take seriously in its endless iterations. Complacency and resignation are discarded for endurance, struggle, strange community, and the surfacing of hope. But we too often give way to despair, as if it's too late. We keep telling ourselves the ark is already sailed, and we live in the aftermath of an inevitable inundation. This is a famous painting by Thomas Cole about what it looked like after the water subsided. And you can see the only human content is a skull at the very bottom. Nothing's really been saved, and he didn't place an ark in it at all. Noah was obedient to God. He built the ark and never questioned that the waters must arrive and that everything outside it had to drown. He believed that the world unfolds in a downward turning, in a drownward turning, better things arriving only after an apocalypse wipes everything away that has been. Catastrophe is quite literally a downward turn. That's what the word means. But can we turn catastrophe down? Or can we at least not be so resigned to stories about small communities safe inside their arks? No doubt we must desist in attempting to abstract ourselves or float above this drowning world. We have to learn immersion. We have to learn how to swim. That's life in the waterlogged Anthropocene. But what about those who don't know how to swim? What about those banned from the ark? What about a community of the unrelated, or at least affinities that exceed near family? In the Chester play of Noah's Flood, a late medieval drama that reenacts the Genesis story of the flood for a city audience. I went too far. Didn't mean to show you that. So Noah's wife refuses to board the boat, and she imagines an effective gathering of the drowned. The little song at the bottom is a song that Noah's wife, when she's refusing to get on board, sings with her friends. She calls them the good gossips. They sing together and they drink together as the waters start to rise. The song of these women, as the waves engulf them, resounds as powerfully as the holy hymn that will be sung later in the play in the ark as it lifts above their drowned bodies. It's interesting to note that the audience watching this play would have stood with the people drowning and would have been those who are not admitted to the ark. Now, we too often imagine ourselves as naturally being those who will board the ark. When the door shuts, we and those we love will be saved. But what if we refuse to close the gate or wall against some kind of feared exterior? What if instead of arks we built rafts? What if we better realize that radical hospitality means welcoming even unwanted togetherness? What if we gave up secure arks for ephemeral havens and capacious refuge? What new kinds of community might form? My favorite Noah illustration. I don't know what the future holds, but I suspect the frameworks we've internalized from our meager version of the biblical flood are not serving us all that well in imagining the contours of life, all life, in the face of ecological catastrophe, in life during the Anthropocene, the epoch during which humans have so profoundly altered Earth's climate that we are readable in the geological record. We can't glimpse a universal flood there, but we can see ourselves. So let's open the archive and welcome the excluded, human and inhuman, radically. Let's cease to be resigned to allowing people or animals or even olive trees and rocks to drown. Let's keep in mind that a future of submerged cities is a future of unequally distributed suffering, of environmental injustice. Katrina in New Orleans taught us that, but so does the story of Noah in its fullness. By not embracing resignation, we can turn down catastrophe, even if we cannot escape watery perturbations. An ark's value may not reside in its walls so much as in their breaching, in their ability, even as flotsam, to enable as wide a collective as possible not to drown. So build an ark if you must. But keep in mind that its fellowship will gather a community of humans and non-humans alike, an archive of the diverse that offers little stability. Let your ark have many windows. Let its occupants go for the occasional swim and mingle with the sea. And if, as in a Jewish folktale of the 19th century depicted here, insisted, the giant Og of Bashan should ride a unicorn through the rising waters and decide to join you on your ark, well, that's okay too. The world is always wider than we expect. Thank you.
First question about the artwork presented in our exhibition on the second floor. The art project from Sarah Kuhlman, Russian artist, and the work dedicated to a world of new materials such as nanomaterials, crystals, and materials with a shape memory effect. We can treat a gold as a chemical element or physical element, and also at the same time we can treat a gold as an important, significant part of human civilization. And also the chemical revolution led to appearance of high complex polymers that led to that opened a new era of plastic, let's say. So the condition of material being is its own social role. So there is two questions. Is it possible to find another natural born actors with a social life? And can we conclude that the stone has his own political role?
That's a great question. So partly it's getting at the stakes of how autonomous humans are from their world. And we like to think that we are independent from the world in which we inhabit. But I think a substance like gold shows the ways in which, as much as we would like to think that we are free from the world, that we have the ability to do whatever we want, we are constrained by and part of the narratives of other substances. For example, if you're wearing any gold with you today in the form of jewelry, an interesting thing about gold is that it can't be created on Earth. We don't have the conditions for it. The only way it got to Earth was being created in supernovas and then being pulled into Earth's orbit, which is to say that because the supply of gold is so limited, any gold that people wear today tends to be kinds that have been melted and remelted, and much of it goes back to even the era of the Phoenicians. It's ancient stuff. And when you think of it that way, as the human attraction toward a metal that's so precious, we can mold it, we can make it, we can create with it, but we can't create the thing itself. It's an invitation to fashioning and to trade and to commerce because of its rarity and because of its glimmer. It shows the way in which gold is not a passive component of social relations, but helps humans to form their cultures. Wars get started over gold. It's a trigger to all kinds of human actions. And I suppose the other side of your question is, then do the elements, forces, and materials have their own kinds of politics and political sources, or a kind of sociality to them? Another way, another thing that fascinates me is the first democracy, the first kind of voting democracy in the West took place in Iceland at a place called Thingvellir. And Thingvellir is where the two continental plates are ripping apart. And if anyone's ever been there, there's a big hole that's opening in the earth. And there was something so powerful about the story that the earth is disclosing about being ripped apart and yet enlarging, that it drew human beings to it who decided that they would judge their most important cases in this space. I don't think it's accidental. I think it's an invitation to think about how what we humans do is often continuous or parallel with what the earth itself is doing with us, to us, before us, and after us.
Thank you. The next questions. I must admit my unexcusable level of innocence, or I would say stupidity, because just a few years ago I was realized that the soil is made by the humus, the compost, and my mama told me, and I was really shocked when a few months after I made like a soil, like a big bunch of soil by myself, by the organic waste, and there was lots of soil, and this transformation from organic to inorganic, that's really like interesting and maybe shocked for kids as well as a process of condensation or let's say sublimation. Is there any opposite transformation from inorganic to organic, and what is the most romantic, let's say, transformation you can call in the transformation in the nature that you can find?
So, and one of the things that I've been fascinated in my career by is the interface between humans and stone, so geology and what makes us human. Here's a curious fact to think about. Billions of years ago, when bacteria learned how to produce oxygen and not live in an anaerobic world without oxygen. Sorry, billions of years ago, there were two kinds of bacteria, both the kind that produce oxygen and the kind that don't. Once enough oxygen was in the atmosphere, those that didn't got choked out and died. Right? This great oxygenation event. As a result of that, there was enough oxygen in the air from then on to create all kinds of rocks and minerals that could not have existed without the oxygenated Earth atmosphere. In other words, it took living creatures in order to allow a flourishing of the mineral world that we now just assume has always been there, but it couldn't have been there until living creatures produced enough oxygen for those animals, for those minerals to flourish. On the other side of things, it took animals, which didn't originally have backbones, learning to take calcium out of the world to create things like backbones and bone structure, which is really the stone that we carry in our body that gives us the gift of mobility, that made life forms able to flourish and to move and to do all the amazing things that they do now. So I always think of it as being a kind of a two-way street between what's supposedly living and what's supposedly dead or inert. It's really hard to put that division into place. It's always being crossed.
Do you believe in this division into the living form and non-living form, or living form and dead form, personally?
I believe that humans have always wanted to make that division, but I have never found the place where that division holds. So, for example, when we die, when we become corpses, what we enable is the flourishing of other kinds of life. Other organisms are very happy to live on the ecosystem of a dead body and to turn it into other things. And you talked about where soil comes from. Soil comes from the flourishing of organisms that break everything down. Mushrooms love that kind of decay. So I don't know. I think it's almost impossible to say that anything is dead or inert. Everything is in perpetual motion.
Hold on. You need to use this microphone with the translation because we can have a question in Russian.
Okay.
I already have a question about a particular kind of space, which is Noah's Ark. And with this project, we attempted to create a space that French anthropologist Marc Auger would call a non-place, a place of transience, a transit point, a place that doesn't have a specific and definite point of that doesn't apply a point of departure and a point of destination. Noah's Ark is a boat, and I thought that Michel Foucault is in his text on different places called that kind of spaces like boats and prisons, cemeteries, brothels, colonies. He called it heterotopes, a place where the laws, the usual laws that that exist in other places. They are suspended. But heterotopias are always function in relation to other places. So even though Noah's Ark is actually a boat, it probably couldn't be called a heterotopia in Foucault's sense of the word, because it is the only place that was left after the flood. So I'm wondering, is there any way to describe this particular type, unique type of space, which is Noah's Ark, or should we probably coin some other term? So thank you.
I kept calling Noah's Ark a narrative transport device, meaning that it's a thing that brings you somewhere else. And what I tried to get at in that is that few people would actually want to be on Noah's Ark. It would be, to be stuck in there with all the animals for a year would be intolerable, suffocating, claustrophobic. The Bible doesn't even describe its inside, but lots of people tried to think about what it must have been like to live in there. And I think probably the closest thing to it would not even be a heterotopia, but Foucault's panopticon, where everything is put into its place and you're constantly under surveillance. And it is not a place of welcome. It's a place of refuge and preservation, but at really high cost. And I think for that reason, ultimately, it's not surprising that almost every artist who's decided to paint a picture of Noah's Ark has done it from a distance. It's intolerable to be on the inside, but it's liberating in some ways to think about either standing with the drowned or thinking about where the ark goes or sending it somewhere. It's something that seems to want an outside perspective, and an invitation's often to stand with the drowned and the excluded and to feel what it is like not to be given welcome or not to be given refuge. So it's hard to find very positive descriptions of the interior of the ark other than someone in a very cursory way describing it as maybe a holy place or a vessel, but it's an archive that preserves at great cost.
I have a question that is probably not too scientific, but more about imagining different scenarios for the future. All of the amazing manuscripts that you showed, and of course show this catastrophe and suffering, and what. So I wanted to ask about this category of suffering with, or this what you called the universal distribution of suffering, something like that, because they all show us the suffering from human perspective, of course. But with like mobile technology, you really distance yourself from catastrophe. Like you can observe a catastrophe, but you do not define yourself with it, and you do not, and you kind of lack this ability to suffer with. So I'm wondering, just imagining some, futuristic and utopian or maybe anti-utopian scenarios, would this shift from from human perspective to non-human perspective, maybe will it bring us in the future, like other manuscripts that show the same catastrophes or the same events, but from the non-human perspective, and how they could possibly look like?
That has been something that's been thought about and discussed in science fiction, especially. There's a writer, Alexander Tchaikovsky, who's written a book called Children of Time that tries to describe from a non-human point of view what it would be like to have an ark full of humans arrive on your planet and think that it's their refuge when it's always been your refuge. And he does a really good job. Of course, ultimately it's human-centered in that he has to use language and think about all that, but trying to think from a non-human point of view. But one thing I would emphasize coming out of your question, especially you talk about biotechnology and the kind of lack of sympathy toward things like catastrophe and destruction and so forth. On the one hand, I totally get that, but I don't think that people who are doing work on inhuman agency are making an argument that the things that make us human should be given up upon, or that, for example, all things, human and inhuman, are equal and are to be equally welcomed. There is a reason why even at this exhibit, this Hotel of Radical Hospitality, the windows are closed and there are dehumidifiers to preserve things. Birds are not welcome. Wildlife can't come in and out. It can't ruin the artwork. It is
to invite the birds and dogs and animals, but yeah, we cannot do it. I mean, that was a part of.
That's great, because that's where the law draws the limit, right? But we will always live with, I think, a human compulsion to self-preserve. We will not welcome the virus into our bodies, for example. And we don't. There's something about us that we want to go on with, and that's part of what makes us human. That's part of the conservation work that can be good. Another way of putting this is, I think that every act of welcome, every kind of ethics that we do, does have a violence to it, and it's better if we think about it rather than to pretend that it's not there.
I ask you about the Alien, the new movie that just released a couple of weeks ago. In your text, Monster Theory, you wrote, "The monsters always escapes because it refuses easy categorization, defining every natural law of evolution, mix of humanoids, reptilian, bivalve, machinarian, etc." And then you wrote, "The monster notoriously appears at the time of crisis as a kind of third term." So let's take as an example the Alien movies. Do you think there is a certain correlation between the years when its different part came out? Let's look at it. 1979, 1976, 1992, 1997, 2012, 2017. Almost every 5 years the new movies comes up. And is there any correlation between these years and corresponding crisis, be it like economical, political, or social?
So that it gets at a hard question about monsters. Do they arrive in order to embody a particular crisis that's going on, or is there something that's kind of not historical about them? And the problem is that we've been in a perpetual state of crisis this entire time. I mean, when is the crisis gone? I think part of living under the current system that we live in is crisis is perpetual, and it serves some people well, so they have a lot invested in keeping crisis going. I think the more interesting question, or an interesting question to ask about the return of certain monsters that keep coming back, like the alien monster, is that on the one hand, such a creature is made to embody all of our fears, and that's why it gets killed off. Except we know it's only killed off for a while and it's going to come back, because we also have an investment of desire in it. There's something about the more than human, the not human, that activates, even if we know it's wrong and that it has to go in the end, but it activates our heart, our investments, our desires, even our wrongful desires. And so we want the story replayed. And I think that in some ways gets at Noah's Ark as well, where it comes laden with history, but it keeps appearing so many times that it's not simply historical. You can't just reduce it to its context. I think there are certain things that grip the human imagination, including myths and monsters, that ultimately resist being put into easy historical context.
My last question, if you don't have any other questions. Since you edited a book called Ecology Beyond the Green, I wanted to ask you about this eco-criticism and what this really means. And in fact, and Tim Morton writes about ecology without a nature. So, for instance, so my question is, what's wrong with nature or green, and why should we think beyond them, beyond green?
Yeah, so sometimes green becomes the color of happy ecological coexistence. And we imagine that if we're green enough, meaning that we recycle enough, compost enough, save enough energy, we're going to be okay, and that we don't have to change our lives. You know, I think what we've come to realize is that we're not going to be okay, and recycling is not going to save the world, and there are more profound problems out there that living a so-called green lifestyle is going to solve. And part of the project of this book that you're talking about, and the reason I have so many colors behind this illustration is, you can't, if you're going to think seriously about things that are not human, you have to think seriously about the entire spectrum, including the spectrum that we can't see, the ultraviolet, X-ray, you know, the things that we need technology to even imagine. Green is good, and it's fine, but it's only a starting point. I think we have to think the complexities of every kind of non-human by embracing the materialities and potentials of other colors as other modes of thinking and criticism.
If we can see Noah as the first curator in history, because he, what is curatorial practice other than sorting, selecting, choosing, excluding, that is exactly what Noah did. Or is it in this case? Would in this case God be the curator, because actually Noah followed the injunctions. At least Noah of Genesis followed the injunctions and the commands of God. So I was wondering what do you think about it? And would Noah's Ark be in that case the first museum of natural history?
But what's interesting about it as a curated exhibition is that everything is so tightly contained that it becomes also a place of circumscription and control and not enough space, a place, honestly, that when people tried to figure out exactly how Noah's Ark worked, it drove them crazy as a kind of exhibition space or containment space where you couldn't quite get everything to stay in place. So people worried about things like how on the ark, well, where they put the food, how they cleaned it up. If the animals came 2 by 2, then what did the lions eat? They couldn't be eating the lamb. So there were so many problems with the curatorial project that it became an invitation to thinking about the limits of both Noah's and God's hospitality, which was too exclusive, ultimately.
Мне подсказывают, что все-таки был вопрос в зале. Может быть, мы упустили его, и кто-то хочет его задать. Ну, хорошо. Thank you very much for coming. It was a great lecture.